In 1931, a 36-year-old gangster named Lucky Luciano walked into a secret meeting in Chicago with a proposal that would change organized crime forever. He wanted to end the bloodshed. He wanted to create structure. He wanted to divide New York City into 5 territories, controlled by 5 families. What happened next would create the most powerful criminal organization in American history. But here's what most people don't know. Those 5 families, they're still here, still operating. And the family connections that exist today are absolutely insane. This is the real story of the 5 families. And trust me, it's nothing like the movies. Section 1. The Bloody Origins. To understand how 5 families came to control New York, we need to go back to 1930, and we need to talk about a war that most people have never heard of. It was called the Castellamarese War, and it was brutal. Picture this: New York City, the height of Prohibition. Alcohol is illegal, which means selling it is insanely profitable. Italian organized crime is booming, but there's a problem. 2 problems, actually. 2 men who both want to be the boss of bosses. On one side, Joe the Boss Masseria, an old-school Sicilian mobster who controlled most of Manhattan. Ruthless, traditional, and absolutely convinced he should run everything. On the other side, Salvatore Maranzano, a Sicilian immigrant from the town of Castellammare del Golfo, which is where the war got its name. Maranzano was different. He was educated. He studied Julius Caesar. He had a vision for organized crime that went beyond just street violence. And these 2 men, they hated each other. From 1930 to 1931, New York became a war zone. Mobsters were being gunned down in the streets. Entire families were being wiped out. The body count kept rising. Over 60 men were killed in just 18 months. But here's where it gets interesting. There was a young gangster working for Masseria. His real name was Salvatore Lucania, but everyone called him Lucky Luciano. And Lucky? He was watching this war and thinking, this is insane. This is bad for business. See, Lucky Luciano understood something that the old-timers didn't. He understood that endless violence was unsustainable. He understood that the future of organized crime wasn't about being the toughest guy in the room. It was about being the smartest. So Lucky made a decision that would change everything. He decided to kill his own boss. April 15th, 1931. Coney Island, Brooklyn. Lucky Luciano invited Joe Masseria to lunch at a restaurant called Nuova Villa Tamaro. They ate, they talked, they played cards, and then at exactly 3:30 p.m., Lucky Luciano excused himself to go to the bathroom. What happened next took less than 30 seconds. The moment Luciano left the room, 4 gunmen walked in. Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, Bugsy Siegel. They surrounded Masseria's table and opened fire. 20 shots. 5 hit Masseria. He died instantly, slumped over his cards, still holding the ace of diamonds. When police arrived, Lucky Luciano was still in the bathroom. He claimed he didn't see anything, didn't hear anything. Convenient, right? But here's the twist. Lucky didn't do this alone. He'd made a deal with the enemy, with Salvatore Maranzano. The deal was simple. Lucky would eliminate Masseria, and in return, Maranzano would end the war and restructure the entire organization. And that's exactly what happened. The birth of the 5 families. After Masseria's death, Maranzano called a meeting. Over 500 mobsters showed up. basically every Italian gangster in New York. And Maranzano stood up and announced his grand plan. He was going to organize crime, literally. Maranzano had studied Roman military structure, and he wanted to apply it to the mob. He created a hierarchy: boss at the top, then underboss, then consigliere, advisor, then capos, captains, then soldiers. A clear chain of command. And then came the big announcement. He divided New York into 5 territories, 5 families, each with their own boss, each with their own operations, but all answering to one man at the very top, the capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. And who would be that boss? Salvatore Maranzano himself, of course. The 5 families were: 1. The Maranzano family, later called the Bonanno family, led by Maranzano himself, then Joseph Bonanno, 2. The Profaci family, later the Colombo family, led by Joe Profaci, 3. The Mangano family, later the Gambino family, led by Vincent Mangano, 4. The Gagliano family, later the Lucchese family, led by Tommy Gagliano, 5. The Luciano family, later the Genovese family, led by Lucky Luciano. Each family controlled different rackets: gambling, prostitution, labor unions, construction, the waterfront. They had territories in Manhattan, Brooklyn, the Bronx, Queens. They had politicians on payroll, judges, cops. They controlled everything. It was brilliant. It was organized. It was supposed to end the violence. There was just one problem. Lucky Luciano didn't trust Maranzano. Not one bit. Section 3. The second betrayal. Remember, Lucky had just betrayed and murdered his own boss. He understood how this game worked. And he was watching Maranzano very carefully. And what he saw scared him. Maranzano was becoming paranoid, drunk on power. He was talking about being the boss of all bosses. He was demanding tribute from all the families. He was making lists, literal hit lists, of people he wanted eliminated. And Lucky Luciano's name was on that list. So Lucky did what Lucky did best. He struck first. September 10th, 1931, just 5 months after Massaria's death. 4 men dressed as police officers walked into Maranzano's office in the Grand Central Building in Manhattan. They claimed they were there for a raid. Maranzano, thinking they were real cops, cooperated. They weren't cops. They were killers, sent by Lucky Luciano. They shot Maranzano 6 times and stabbed him multiple times for good measure. The boss of all bosses was dead. And just like that, Lucky Luciano had eliminated both of the old guard leaders in less than 6 months. But here's what makes Lucky different. What makes him, arguably, the most important mobster in American history. He didn't try to become the boss of all bosses himself. Section 4. The Commission, the real power structure. Instead, Lucky Luciano created something that had never existed before in organized crime: the Commission. Think of it like a board of directors for the Mafia. The bosses of the 5 families would meet regularly to settle disputes, approve major hits, divide territories, and make decisions that affected all of organized crime. No one person in charge. Decisions made by consensus. Democracy for gangsters. The original commission included Lucky Luciano, Luciano family; Tommy Gagliano, Gagliano family; Joe Profaci, Profaci family; Vincent Mangano, Mangano family; Joseph Bonanno, Bonanno family; plus representatives from Chicago and Buffalo. And this structure, it worked for decades. But what the five families didn't know in 1931 was that their new system, their brilliant structure, contained the seeds of its own destruction. Because when you create a system where five families share power, you create five families that will eventually go to war with each other. And those wars would make the Castellamarese War look like a playground fight. But we'll get to that. First, let's talk about the Golden Age. Fascinating, detailed, almost admiring. From the 1930s through the 1950s, the five families didn't just control crime in New York, they controlled New York. Let me give you some numbers that are absolutely insane. By the 1950s, the five families had an estimated 3,000 to 5,000 made members, actual sworn-in mafiosos. But their influence extended to over 100,000 associates, people who worked for them or paid them tribute. They controlled the Fulton fish market, meaning every piece of seafood sold in New York, they got a cut. They controlled the garment district, every dress, every suit, they got a cut. They controlled the waterfront, every ship that came into New York Harbor, they got a cut. They controlled garbage collection, construction, concrete, labor unions. Conservative estimates suggest that by the 1960s, the five families were earning the equivalent of $90 billion per year in today's money. $90 billion from five families. Let that number land. And the crazy thing? Most people had no idea. They operated in the shadows. They dressed in nice suits. They ran legitimate businesses. They went to church on Sundays. The Gambino family ran a meat distribution company. The Genovese family controlled unions. The Lucchese family had construction contracts all over the city. They weren't just criminals. They were businessmen. Very violent businessmen, but businessmen nonetheless. That remember what I said about the seeds of destruction. By the 1970s and 80s, the peace that Lucky Luciano had created started to crumble. And it crumbled in the most violent way possible. Let me tell you about just a few of the wars. The Gallo-Profaci War, 1961 to 1963. Joe Gallo, a member of the Profaci family, decided he wasn't getting enough respect, so he kidnapped the bosses of his own family. Multiple murders ended with Gallo getting shot to death at a restaurant in Little Italy in 1972, on his birthday. The Banana War, 1964 to 1968. The Bonanno family basically went to war with itself after boss Joe Bonanno tried to have other commission members killed. Over a dozen dead. The Bonanno family was so unstable that they were kicked off the commission. The Castellano murder, 1985. This is a big one. Paul Castellano, boss of the Gambino family, the richest, most powerful family, was gunned down outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. December 16th, 1985. Rush hour, Midtown Manhattan. Shot 6 times in front of horrified witnesses. Who ordered the hit? A capo named John Gotti. And John Gotti? He would become the face of the Mafia in the 1980s. Flashy, arrogant, called himself the Dapper Don and the Teflon Don because charges never seemed to stick. But Gotti also did something that the old-timers would have never done. He loved attention. He talked to reporters. He wore $2,000 suits. He became famous. And that fame would help destroy the five families. Section 7. The FBI's secret weapon. Investigative, building to revelation. Because while the five families were fighting among themselves, the FBI was watching. And they had a new weapon that the Mafia never saw coming. RICO.
the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, passed in 1970. Before RICO, prosecuting mobsters was nearly impossible. You'd arrest a soldier, he'd
Take the fall. To a few years, come out to a nice payday. The bosses stayed untouchable. But RICO changed everything. It allowed prosecutors to charge the entire organization as a criminal enterprise. It meant that if you could prove someone was part of the organization, you could hold them responsible for everything the organization did. And the FBI had another weapon: bugs, wiretaps, surveillance. In the 1980s, the FBI planted listening devices everywhere, in social clubs, in cars, in homes. They recorded thousands of hours of conversations, and what they heard was damning. But here's what's truly shocking. Even with RICO, even with wiretaps, even with decades of FBI investigations and hundreds of arrests, the 5 families never actually went away. Revealing, contemporary, shocking. This is the part that most people don't understand. When you hear that, the Mafia is dead or gone, that's not exactly true. Yes, they're weaker. Yes, they're smaller. Yes, the golden age is over. But the 5 families still exist, right now, today. Let me show you the current structure based on FBI reports and court documents. 1. The Genovese family. Still considered the most powerful. Estimated 250 made members. Still controls parts of the New York waterfront and unions. Current boss, as of recent reports, Liborio Barney Bellomo. 2. The Gambino family. Once the most powerful under Gotti, now weakened but still operational. Estimated 200 members. Current boss, Domenico Cefalù, though he's elderly and the leadership is disputed. 3. The Lucchese family. Heavily damaged by prosecutions but still active. Estimated 100 members. Involved in labor racketeering and construction. 4. The Colombo family. Went through a bloody civil war in the 1990s that killed dozens. Weakened but still exists. Estimated 100 members. 5. The Bonanno family. Was infiltrated by FBI agent Joseph Pistone, Donnie Brasco, in the 1970s to 80s, which devastated them. But they rebuilt, estimated 100 members. Now here's where it gets really interesting: the family connections. Many current members are literally descended from the original families. Sons, grandsons, nephews. The same bloodlines that Lucky Luciano organized in 1931. For example, Joseph Massino, former Bonanno boss, was connected to families going back to the 1930s. The Persico family has controlled the Colombo family for 3 generations. Multiple Gambino family members are related to Carlo Gambino, who ran the family in the 1960s to 70s. It's not just an organization, it's literally families. Fathers passing the business to sons, uncles bringing in nephews, cousins vouching for cousins. And that family structure? That's what's kept them alive. Section 9. What they do now. So what does the modern mafia actually do? They've adapted. They're not running speakeasies anymore. They're not as visible. But they're still making money. Current operations include labor racketeering, controlling unions, especially in construction and garbage collection, loan sharking, illegal high-interest loans, gambling, illegal sports betting, poker games, online gambling operations, drug trafficking. Though this was traditionally forbidden, many modern families are involved. Extortion, protection rackets, especially in construction. Stock fraud, pump and dump schemes, market manipulation, cybercrime. Yes, really, the Mafia has moved into identity theft and online fraud. A 2021 FBI report estimated that organized crime in New York, primarily the five families, still generates over $50 million per year. Not billions like the old days, but $50 million is nothing to sneeze at. And here's something that should terrify you. They're harder to catch now. They don't meet in social clubs anymore. They use encrypted phones. They communicate in code. They've learned from decades of FBI surveillance. The old guys like Lucky Luciano and Carlo Gambino would be proud. So let's come back to where we started. In 1931, Lucky Luciano walked into a meeting with a simple idea. Divide New York into 5 territories. Create structure. End the chaos. And for a while, it worked. The five families became the most successful criminal organization in American history. They made billions. They controlled an entire city. They operated for decades with near impunity. But here's the thing about Lucky's system. It was built on violence. And violence eventually consumes everything. The wars, the betrayals, the murders. They never really stopped. They just evolved. Joe Masseria, betrayed by Lucky Luciano. Maranzano, betrayed by Lucky Luciano. Paul Castellano, betrayed by John Gotti. John Gotti, betrayed by Sammy the Bull Gravano, who turned informant. The same pattern, over and over. Because when your entire system is built on the threat of violence, eventually that violence turns inward. And yet, they're still here. Weaker, smaller, but still here. The family connections still exist. The structure still exists. The commission still meets, though much less frequently. It's been over 90 years since Lucky Luciano created the five families. Most criminal organizations don't last 90 months, let alone 90 years. So what's the lesson here? Maybe it's that structure and organization can make even illegal enterprises incredibly resilient. Maybe it's that family loyalty, even in the darkest contexts, is an incredibly powerful force. Maybe it's that the line between legitimate business and organized crime has always been thinner than we'd like to admit. Or maybe the lesson is simpler. Five families succeeded not because they were the most violent, but because they were the most organized. They treated crime like a business. They created systems. They thought long-term. And that's why, even today, almost a century later, when FBI agents are investigating organized crime in New York, they're still investigating the same five families. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, make sure you're subscribed because we've got more deep dives into the hidden histories that shaped our world. And here's a question for you. Do you think the Mafia could ever truly disappear? Or is organized crime just too profitable, too adaptable, to ever really die? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.